Lucky to have Louis Rimakum from Tata Steel. Louis has been associated a bit with the Institute for Sustainable Resources in the past, and we're really grateful that you can make the time to come and talk to us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Yeah, I think one of my other roles is that I'm the chairman of the Sustainable Development Group at the Institute of Materials, so I get feeding from all the other material sectors as well. So what I'm going to say isn't only about steel, but probably reflects some of the other material sectors as well. And going from the discussions that we've had already about the pessimism about the Commission, just a quick thought on that is that if Europe doesn't start to compete on resource efficiency, it will fall behind the very strong nations like Korea, Japan, and maybe China and India in the future, because they will accelerate technology that might leapfrog us in technology terms. So, as far as I'm concerned, resource efficiency is absolutely crucial. My first slide after this is hopefully my dullest slide, because I felt obliged that I should tell you what our industry thinks, what the European steel industry thinks. And I'm not going to go through all this list, except to say that all industries, first of all, the steel industry in Europe is pretty supportive of resource efficiency. We all think that resource efficiency for business could be a win-win. It means you might have more efficient operational processes, less waste, higher energy efficiency and so on. But also, if your products are more energy efficient, potentially you might be able to sell more because they'll meet the targets of our customers and so on going forward. But this list is really about any industry would do this, going through a management process of the risk. You know, if you're going to set policy and regulations, make sure you don't kill our industry off at the same time. That's the kind of thing that goes on. These are not my words, these are kind of Eurofer. In fact, it's not just Eurofer, it's a group of mineral companies who've said this. But some of the good things in there are, they're saying we welcome it, but we welcome it in the context of sensible regulation, life cycle thinking. Michelle talked about that. And also in a way that ensures that we don't end up with, like carbon leakage. You know, if steel industry disappeared in Europe, it would just migrate to China or wherever else. And that wouldn't be in fact, the Chinese steel industry has grown so quickly in the last 10 years, it's absolutely unbelievable. They're virtually making as much steel in China now as the world made 50 years ago. So, and a lot of those sites that generate steel were not done with environmental regulations in mind. Anyway, so I won't dwell on that, but I will move to the scary slide, which is if you think about the challenges, and this is for steel, but I think it's probably very similar for other materials, concrete, perhaps aluminium, and a few others, where and if I had a point I'd do it, but basically we make about 1.2, well, in 2010 we made 1.2 billion tonnes of steel in the world. And that equates to a life cycle figure of about 2 billion tonnes of CO2, which is roughly 2 tonnes of CO2 per tonne of steel. Where the climate change agenda would like us to be is at least 50% better than that, maybe even 80% better than that. So, but if we carry on as we are and hurdle towards 2050, with the rates of improvement in standards of living and so on from all the various sectors of the world, China, India, South America, Africa eventually, we'll do this. We didn't change anything else, we would probably double the requirement for steel in the future. And effectively it would be 4 times more than what the desired targets would be. So as an industry you think, well, how can we even begin to think about approaching this? And if you're very optimistic, you could say, well, we could have some fantastic technologies that improve the way we operate our plants. Things like carbon capture and storage, which is not very popular, I have to say. It's not very good from an economic viewpoint. Carbon capture utilisation, improve operational efficiencies, that kind of thing. But even, and one project was in Europe that called ULCOS, which set out to reduce CO2 emissions by 50%. And it did a great job at theoretically looking at technologies, but no realisation of practicality yet. So if you're very optimistic, you might be able to use that to get halfway there, but there's got to be another realisation that really we should be thinking about reuse, recycling and reduce. In other words, provide the same kind of functionality but with less material, if you like. And also think about the fact that maybe as an industry, maybe we shouldn't be producing, you know, lots more steel, but reusing the current stock that's in the infrastructure. And those concepts are in discussion in the UK, they're in discussion worldwide. We're not quite sure how to get there, and I'll talk a bit about that later on. But then the other big hit, really, and those are quite optimistic things, is to think a lot more about when we do provide a product. All right, it might be a higher strength steel, so it's less steel, but then what does that do for the product performance? And that's where product performance comes into it, and life cycle thinking comes into it. And that's a typical chart of a life cycle performance of something made of steel. So it could be a car, it could be a building with a building frame, it could be an engineering component. And basically what happens is, although the mining and manufacture of the steel might appear to be quite a big environmental impacts, the actual use phase for those kind of examples I've stated is some 70% of the whole life cycle. So actually by lightweighting with steel you could get quite a big benefit in that part of the life cycle phase. So we need to think a bit more about that. In other words, in terms of the products we provide to society, we need to understand the applications. Very often the people who are requesting the steel from us don't understand that the steel that we make and the technology could help to improve it. There's kind of a technological barrier there. But also recycling end of life, you get a bit of a credit because you put in material, you recover that material, and you could avoid producing primary. So that's one thought. The policymakers obviously, I don't know, 15 years ago realised that was a very good thing to do. Think about the way the consumer works, how do you get the energy down. And in a way that was certainly the right approach because that's where the biggest hits were. So the automotive industry been driving its fuel usage rates down. In the UK we've had zero carbon building targets and discussions and so on. But of course you have to do this, an example of where you've got to think a bit more about the life cycle is for example in automotive, if you concentrate on the use phase and you look at all the initiatives internationally that show that the fleet vehicle energy consumptions are being driven down, partly from targets like the CAFE targets in North America and the European targets. And the auto industry has done pretty well with it in terms of hybrids, electric vehicles, the drivetrain efficiency and so on, which is good. But also materials, they're looking for lighter materials, and that's a good thing. But then you have to be careful, and I'm not trying to push steel here particularly, but I'm trying to put the context in that some materials may be lightweight, but they carry with them a high environmental burden upstream. And that would include aluminium to some extent, magnesium, maybe the carbon fibre resins has a high impact but not very recyclable, all those things. So you do need to think about what the overall impact will be, and that's when, and in my industry we look at this, the aluminium industry also look at this to be fair, and we have to look at, if you have got a bigger hit with the lighter materials at the beginning, how long will it take throughout the life cycle to make sure you get that back? Otherwise you're just emitting more now. And it varies. I mean, there's no straight winner with this. Sometimes it's steel, sometimes aluminium. It's rarely carbon fibre at the moment, I'll say that, because it's such a big hit. Magnesium probably not very good at the moment. But things move. Technology moves on. And all the steels you can do is continue to start to produce higher strength and formable steels that will allow lightweighting. We will always we will overtake some aluminium in very high-end large cars, Jaguar Land Rovers and so on, tend to be probably the right choice at that level, although we'll keep improving. But the point is that the other kind of long-term thought about this is that as you do decarbonise use phase, and that's where we're heading into, again, very optimistic to get to zero, but what is going to happen is you're going to require more stuff. So buildings are going to have photovoltaics on, cars are going to have batteries in them perhaps. Buildings might have triple insulation or triple glazing or other sandwich panels. So there might be more stuff, and then the agenda becomes less about the use phase and becomes more about the material throughout the life cycle. In other words, and particularly if some of the new materials you're putting on are less recyclable, so you're going to have to think about that. So Michelle reflected some of the comments that I made in the questionnaire about this, because we need to get a much more emphasis on the material efficiency, I think. I appreciate energy efficiency and carbon are very important and go along with that, but my belief is if you can try and improve material efficiency, you will get carbon benefits, you will get some of the energy benefits as well. Part of that is, and Michelle mentioned it, is about understanding what happens with recycling. because when someone says, oh yes, it's recyclable, what does that mean? I think most people think of it as anything that avoids landfill, and that's true. And this was some stats from 3 different construction sector industries. This is a few years old. I'm going to show you some slightly modified figures. Steel is very recycled, it's very highly recycled. So the challenge for us is not just recycling, it's to get to reuse. That's a really big change for us. Timber industry had quite a lot of landfill at one point. It's a bit more difficult to recycle timber, but they spent a lot, and some of it was going to incineration. Those figures for that industry have actually improved, and I've put these on because on realising that that was the situation, they said, well, this is ridiculous, what can we do instead of putting a landfill on? They tried to set up infrastructure to get more incineration. But the thing is, reuse is kind of the holy grail, because you're reusing things that are in literally quite a circular economy. Incineration is probably not a great thing to do. Basically, you're taking a material that you manufactured and invested energy in it, and you evaporating it, and so on. So it's understanding what the value of recycling is, and trying to push those sectors towards improvements in those areas. Another misunderstanding, misnomer is, and in the steel industry we get this quite commonly, where they say, oh, this steel's okay because it's made from scrap, thinking that that's the panacea, that's the solution. But in fact, what really happens in the world is that there is only a certain amount of scrap, and at the moment, out of the 1.4 billion tonnes we're making now, about 580 has come from scrap. And it's not because we're being, that's how much scrap there is available now, because we didn't make enough steel 20 years ago. Because the rest of that steel is in infrastructure, it's there. So for those, this idea about recycled content, as we call it, scrap, it is a bit of a red herring for sustainability. But what's absolutely crucial, if you start looking at our recycling, our sustainability equations, the recycling rates or the reuse rates and the primary and secondary energies of steel making, they are the route to sustainability. So we've got to make sure that any steel that's made now is available in future for recycling. So anything we do to improve that or reuse the steel would be great. So, and this is, some of you may be familiar with the work of Julian Allwood at Cambridge University. This is WellMet 2050. Nearly all the things on this slide would really improve the sustainability of steel products. And they're right. For example, can we design products that require less metal but perform the same function? It's got the fairly novel bendy beam there. Of course, I will say that it's fine to do that, but you've got to think about the social and economic aspects as well. We really are triple bottom line thinking in my industry, and certainly in my group. Because I'll tell you why we do that, because we know that if something doesn't work socially, eventually it just gets stopped. People just don't use them. So if you had a bendy piece of steel that the guys on site found it difficult to work with, it just wouldn't get going. So understanding the social value, the social impacts of your products becomes critical at that point. Yeah, reducing yield losses, and you'd imagine that industries like ours want to improve yield throughout our business, and we do indeed, absolutely, but I think the novelty here, the innovation aspect, is not about yield just in our own industry. It's about when we provide a product to this guy, what does he do with it? Have we optimised what we pass on to our customers? And there's not, I have to say that surprisingly we're not very good at that. And it might be because there's confidentiality in the businesses that we supply to, they don't want to talk about their products. But if we did have more dialogue with them, we might be able to optimise and improve. So I think breaking down those supply chain barriers could be quite a feature. And Julian has pointed that out in some of his work. Sometimes it's a bit of a shock to find that you provide some steel and they chop it all up and end up with what they want, and they end up with scrap. I'm thinking, well, why don't you ask for something else? So that's a challenge that we need to overcome. I think the other side as well, we'll talk about reuse. That's a massive opportunity for steel, but a massive barrier. There's so many barriers in the way of reusing things, and it's about difficulty of building standards. Could you build a building out of reused steel? Would it be insured? Would it be strong enough? Do you know the credentials of the material? And Michelle talked about, do you have enough data on the history of that steel to trust it, that kind of thing. And there's a few technical barriers to overcome there, but very, very good opportunities. The other barrier there, and I'll talk about later, is the actual business risk of doing something like that. And then durability and more intensive use. The more intensive use thing is about, do we need 3 cars on our driveways or 2 cars? Or could we all have 1 car each and the street shares 1 car and so on? And some of my bosses might not be happy with that concept, but we said, let's do it. Okay, that's great. So, just a few examples to say that we are looking at technologies to try and improve use phase performance in steel. And this is a project called Specific, and it's about functional materials. It's very early days. It's at Swansea University, but with Tata Steel as partners, using materials that are photovoltaic materials or storage materials, sometimes phase change materials, things that absorb energy and release energy at the right times. And the idea is to kind of showcase the potential of improving the power performance of buildings. There's a lot of work to do to get anywhere with it. And there's a few other products about how you can improve the heating of buildings with, and again, it's an example of where we have a sandwich panel where solar hits it, warm air gets drawn through into the building, but that requires 2 pieces of steel, not 1, of course. So the question is, where the resource efficiency needs to be measured in a life cycle context. You find it works pretty well. And integrated solar panels. So I'll move on fairly quickly. There's an example about remanufacturing, particularly yellow goods and Cat Reman, or Caterpillar, as you probably know them as, are genuinely thinking of reusing their yellow good components in future vehicles, and that's really, and if more of our sector customers were going down that line, we need to rethink what we were providing and how we were providing things, and so on. So my last slide is really about my thoughts rather than just the steel industry thoughts, and it's, I think the material efficiency is a crucial thing. If you interested to see indicators, I talked to Michelle about, I am interested to know, what's the mass of materials that made this happen? For steel, we know it's roughly 2 tons of material makes 1 ton of steel, roughly speaking. And what can you do to improve that? And that's drawn out of the ground. What you tend to hear about is resource depletion. Resource depletion is a fairly variable figure depending on economic predictions of what's available on the ground or what's left. I've said it, more emphasis on end of life, and understanding what the value of recycling is. And it's interesting about the plastic bag discussion. Maybe recycling plastic bags is low, but the environmental impact of plastic bags in the ocean is not one. That's a different thing. So it's a question of why are you doing this, what can you avoid? And I do think we need to understand what is the value of recycling, and then separate from that, what is recycling worth? Because some things are reuse and so on. Nurture cooperation across supply chains. I don't know if we break those barriers down, but there's some interesting things that Innovate UK are doing. They have lots of calls on the circular economy, and in some respects they do help with that. But it'd be interesting to get some real kind of supply chain partnerships going. And then, I know industry officers try and have sensible or flexibility in regulations that allow you to do things. I was thinking of things on the train this morning about 4 examples where we could mine materials from some of our landfill sites. We could have put an oily waste into our blast furnace. We could have, we were trying to send some waste, not waste, we were trying to send a sample to Japan so they could do some tests so we could recycle more in the UK. All those things were blocked or took absolutely years to get through because of some rules. And the rules said you can't do that. Mining landfills is an example, and I understand why those rules are there, but it means that you just can't go ahead. It makes sense to do it from a resource efficiency viewpoint, but the rule says, oh, that you could have an impact that we can't control. All I'm asking for really is that the regulators start to think about the resource efficiency umbrella, if you like. So, and if in my experience in Japan, Korea, there seems to be things that are a bit more sensible. They kind of, they don't have rules that stop things. They allow derogation on certain things going forward. So I think that is about, oh yeah, the new business models is massively important in that nobody's going to take big risks with changing their business models unless there's going to be some measure of success. It's very, very hard to predict it. So somebody needs to take some risk and go ahead with kind of a warehouse with reused steel in it. It starts off being an empty warehouse, it's a business model, but it might take 10 years before I start making money out of it. Anyway, I think that any kind of support for that kind of change in business models or return on investment assistance will help. It will help the European as well.
Thank you very much.
Is it.
Okay, we're going to move to some panels. I'm going to ask Jos Bledio from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation to chair this little session and to stimulate our panelists. I think each of them is going to speak for a bit just to introduce themselves, see where they're coming from, and then we'll go into some discussion chaired by Jos.
Thank you very much, Paul. That's an interestingly high level. Thanks very much. Thank you for the welcome, Paul. Yes, I'm Dario. I'm the Executive Officer for the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. I'm notably in charge of policy and communication. We've had the pleasure of working with Paul and his team on the European Resource Efficiency Platform, and delighted to be here as we have a partnership with UCL and Paul's department in particular to promote the acceleration to a circular economy. So I'd like today to welcome Professor Rudy Verzel from University of Hull. Comparative European politics is your domain of expertise. Just to my left is Dr. Charlotte Burns from the University of York, and Nick Eyre from the Environmental Change Institute at Oxford University, and Louis, we just heard from. Thank you very much for that very good presentation, because I believe it bridges the gap between what we've heard in the first session on the policy side, which I have to say was very useful as well, because it provides an extremely clear picture of the changes that have been going on in the Commission, and why some things that were high on the agenda suddenly drop off and can fall through a crack that could be deemed as reasonably small when you look at the diagram, but actually becomes a gaping hole and even a black one sometimes. So, first of all, if we could do a quick round of introduction, so let us know what's your field of expertise, what you work on, and maybe have a couple of your thoughts on what we've heard so far. But I'd just like to do a first roundtable introduction quickly, if that's all right. Rudy.
Okay, I'm Rudy Wilson from Hull University. I'm comparative European politics. My main area is environmental policy, European environmental policy, comparing member states, and EU environmental policy. Not actually research resource efficiency directly, but I can dig indirectly. But let me say something perhaps more general, and then come to some specific comments. On the Commission, whether they will go ahead or not, it's obviously difficult to predict, and a colleague of mine always says it's easier to predict this future with the benefit of hindsight. And he adds, political scientists don't even agree what's happened in the past, and I think both is true. But let me start with something in the past. When I did my PhD on baking water and car emissions of all things, there was a big discussion around the Maastricht Treaty subsidiarity, and there was a British Franco hit list, which had several directives, amongst others environmental policy directives, and a lot of people thought this is going to lead to a rollback of environmental policy. With the benefit of hindsight, not a single of this, including my case study, I was very grateful for that paper, it didn't disappear as my case study, it was not withdrawn or anything. So it's difficult to say actually what will happen. Obviously the political context, I think, is a different one now. Personalities, I'm not entirely sure whether that necessarily means something. When Rita Demiana became environment minister, a lot of people thought he knows only about culture, there's no idea about the environment, and he became a very sort of strong environmental commissioner. But he acted at a different time. What happened at that time, however, was that the person responsible for the legal unit, Ludwig Kremer, was sidelined, and he had to deal with waste. And interesting enough, initially the idea was to actually make him less activist twist and take member states to the European Court of Justice, amongst others, about the Drinking Water Directive. And he became very active in waste, so active that a lot of industry felt he was not actually a good thing. So it's very difficult to predict that. What I think worries me a little bit more is the structural institutional change. Putting DG Environment together with fisheries and maritime is potentially a very risky thing, because obviously commissioners have to prioritize and there are new actors involved there. So that's sort of about the general issue there. I've done a lot of comparative research about policy instruments, where we looked with two colleagues, Andrew Jordan from East Anglia, University of East Anglia, and Caesar from Newcastle, at market-based instruments, voluntary agreements, and traditional regulation. And in that research, I came across EMAs and voluntary agreements. And in the presentations, it was also mentioned that industry likes voluntary agreements more than market-based instruments. And when you talk to industry, that seems to be always plausible. But when you talk to the Commission, how many voluntary agreements are there on the EU level? When we did that research, it was about finished 5 years ago, there were about 12. Hundreds of pieces of legislation, there are lots of market-based instruments. So why does it not happen on the European level? And I think one explanation is concerns about free riding. What do you do if your competitor doesn't comply with it? Voluntary agreements can also be sort of relatively burdensome. I mean, EMAS is, you sign up to it, you have this management audit, and to some degree this should have already led to resource efficiency there. And in fact, when I talked to an environment agency official in Germany in around 2002, he said, oh, don't worry about eco-label, this will anyway disappear, because it's all going to be about resource efficiency policy, and that's the new policy, and that was more than 10 years ago. And we're still talking about resource efficiency policy. Will that now be finally the breakthrough or not? But one thing that struck me is whatever instrument you use, if it's especially voluntary agreements, it was also mentioned in the presentation, the reporting and the burdens, industry obviously has to have some reporting which is not very keen on, that there are certain incentives so that you give industry, if it does report and it does undertake voluntary certain measures, you may be perhaps less stringent in terms of inspections, monitoring, so that there is a real incentive. And perhaps sort of the last issue, and then I stop it because I think I don't want to take up all the time, is life cycle analysis, which I'm very much in favor of. But let me flag up one sort of warning about it. It's very conclusive concept, and I think it's very important. But we could see also in the last presentation, there's also a danger of shifting and who should actually do what in the whole supply chain, or in the whole chain of using the product and so on. And there's also a communication problem sometimes. And a good example is perhaps the way the eco-label was used in Germany and the way the eco-label was used in Austria. The Austrians went for a life cycle analysis, and it's a much more scientific and better way. But it's very difficult to communicate to the average citizen to say this is life cycle analysis and this is what we all did. The German eco-label is straightforward, saying it's environmentally friendly because of, and he mentioned just one thing. Now that's not the right thing of doing it, but in terms of communication, it's actually very effective. And people say, that's why I'm buying this. And if you say, well, it's because, when we produced it and all the data, it's extremely difficult to understand. And I think this is one thing which, when I looked at resource efficiency, is something that is really important, how to communicate as complex a policy, a concept as resource efficiency, in a way that ordinary people understand that and also sort of buy into that. And I think I'll leave it there.
No, thank you very much. It's very interesting. So it begs the question of the harmonization and what kind of latitudes member states have to implement those directives as well. And maybe in that specific case, there's the question of the label fatigue, to lack of a better word, of how much can you confuse people by throwing more information at them. Thank you. Dr. Burns, can I call you Charlotte?
Yeah, or Charlie, all the names what people call me. Hi, I'm Charlie Burns. I'm in the Environment Department at the University of York now, but my background is as a political scientist with an expertise on the European Parliament, where I used to work for the chair of the Environment many years ago now. And so I was really interested in what Teresa had to say about whether or not the changing composition of the the European Parliament will make a difference, and I agree with you, I don't think it will make much of a difference because you've still got that centrist coalition which I think will keep things pretty much on a status quo kind of basis. And I wonder, at the moment I've just got a project to research the impact of austerity on environmental policy in Europe, and so the reorganisation of the Commission seems to play straight into what I'm currently working on. Is this Juncker responding to the austerity agenda, responding as well to the subsidiarity agenda, again being driven by the Brits and being driven by the Dutch as well, so of wanting to have a big idea to get Europe working again and not to be concentrating on little silly things, so they withdrew the Solids Directive after the Dutch and British moves last year. Although I do think it's ironic with plastic bags to focus on that, where we seem to be behind the global south who have moved much faster on having plastic bags, but that's another one. The other thing that struck me though when I heard all the various presentations was, where have the Commission staff moved to? Because we've been talking about commissioners, but actually the bureaucrats who work on the Commission are really important actors, so that might be something that you want to think about. Where are they going to be based? Which DG are they going to be based in? Are they going to be there acting as entrepreneurs behind the scene? Because the other thing that really struck me when we were talking about the reorganisation of the Commission is maybe what this agenda requires is a policy or discourse entrepreneur driving it, and that's what Potocnik was doing, and now he's gone, is there somebody else who can fill that gap, and should that be somebody within the Commission? Should it be you going and persuading the Parliament to do it for you maybe, around the legislation in January? Or, we haven't mentioned non-governmental organisations, and I don't know in the context of this discussion whether or not they're helpful. I certainly think, was it Andrew who said the business case was more important, and he's absolutely right. But Green 10, the coalition of NGOs in Brussels were very effective at saying, Juncker, your environment agenda stinks, and putting a lot of pressure on, along with the Social Democrats in the European Parliament, to get Timmermans getting on the sustainable development agenda. So is there a role that NGOs can be playing here? And now I think I'll stop there so that everyone else can talk and we can get questions.
Brilliant transition, thank you very much. It's actually, I represent an NGO and most of our focus is on making the business case.
There you go.
So if we mixed the two, maybe we're onto something there. Nick, please.
Thanks. I'm Nick Eyre from the Environmental Change Institute at the University of Oxford. I've worked on energy efficiency for quite a long time, about 30 years. I've done some work on resource productivity more generally in the Cabinet Office in 2001, but most of what I can say is going to try to draw some lessons from energy efficiency policy for broader resource productivity policy. The first thing, I was very struck by Louis' talk, because I actually began my working life in energy working on promoting energy efficiency in the steel industry. And I was very struck that you showed a diagram which showed the carbon benefits of that, which nobody in the mid-1980s would ever have done.
Right.
But there were still very active programs, actually probably more active programs in the UK government supporting energy efficiency in the steel industry then than now. And I think the lesson from that is that you do need to be politically flexible about which objectives you highlight for resource efficiency, because there are environmental benefits, there are social benefits, there are economic benefits, and those will play to different powerful actors in different ways at different times. And certainly in UK energy efficiency policy, we've at different times talked about economic benefits that kept the energy efficiency agenda alive in the UK throughout the Thatcher administration. We've talked about fuel poverty more in the last government than under this one. We've talked about climate change when that's been a popular thing to do. And they've all been relevant all the time, but they've been highlighted differently at different times. So I think it is important to recognise that resource productivity has these multiple benefits. But I don't think that means you need to talk to all the audiences about them equally all the time. You just need to be a bit bright about that. My only other comments, Paul asked us to talk a bit about what the Commission should concentrate on. And I think my answer to that is that the Commission should concentrate on the things where the Commission can make a difference. Because many of these topics many of much of what people have talked about resource efficiency may be better driven by businesses themselves, or by local actors, or by member states, or by NGOs. And you think of, say, sustainable timber, there we've got a whole labelling system which has been constructed by non-governmental actors. I'm not saying that's the best way to do it, but it is something that can be done. So the three areas where I think it is probably important that the Commission should go on being active. One is targets. That may be a difficult agenda, but if you look at what we've learned in energy policy, particularly renewables, those legally binding targets have made a difference to member state policies. I take Louis' point, they need to be sensible targets, but actually targets do focus people's minds a bit.
Yeah.
The second will be standards, because the Commission has, Europe has competence on internal market issues, and that those standards under the Eco-Design Directive could be incredibly important in driving resource efficiency across the board. And it's probably the one area where energy and other resources have been institutionally linked in a directive in what ought to be a productive way. And the third, and it's pretty obvious to anybody working in a university, is research and innovation policy, because of the resources available in the Horizon 2020 agenda. It seems to me important that we go on pressing for a big focus of that to be on innovation, not just blue skies, but also what they call the coordination and support actions, which are actually helping to do things like promote new business models. So that would be my answer to Paul's question.
Thank you very much. I think that question about the innovation and research is very important, and it goes back to a point that Michelle was making about the companies saying they don't have access to the right materials. That maybe there's a whole new field that could be invested in, which is new materials for proper recycling, proper reuse, proper stuff that you can actually separate as well. Because we've constructed a lot of hybrids, especially in the field of polymer, that you can actually do anything with it even if you wanted to. Do you want to?
Well, obviously I've said quite a lot already,
Yeah.
so I won't go on too long. But I think it's interesting that the steel industry in Europe is an example of kind of the paralysis that seems to be in Europe about these things, because it's not doing very well. It's not particularly profitable at the moment. There's too much steel in the world because China grew so quickly when they were trying to grow their infrastructure, and they've now got an excess of steel. And some of that steel that's manufactured is pretty low performance carbon-wise, which is not a good thing, obviously. But because of it, the industry, maybe the Commission, are kind of like rapidly staring at the headlights of business failure. We don't get this moving, you're thinking. And we've got to kind of improve our optimism. In other words, I think the job of the Commission is to facilitate change in a way that doesn't kill us off. And I'm sure that's what they're mindful of, but I'm worried that what we said earlier today, the Commission have gone a bit low key on it, is because they think it might derail industry, but it's actually the opposite. It could facilitate, it should become better, more competitive. But it's how do you go through that transition? So I think that's the key. And I'm not a political person, so I'm a technical person, so I'm interested to know what you're all thinking about it. So.
Thank you very much for that. I think we have about 25 minutes for the rest of the session. Probably the best way forward is to open it up to questions from the audience and try to have a live debate and good discussion about this. So it's all yours. It's only the first one, and then they keep on flowing. Somebody please volunteer, and then thank you.
All right. Yeah, new business models. This is directed to Louis. I heard that Tata were looking at a leasing steelworking buildings as a possibility at one point. Is
I think what you've probably heard is the kind of things that I talk about, which is that we ought to be thinking of it. And we're in a partnership with Julian Oliver called In Demand, and there's a lot of discussion about it. But my thesis, I said it in the presentation, but I'll repeat, is that it's got to be a great idea that you'd have a steel frame, and you take the steel frame and put it in a warehouse, and when somebody else wants it, you take it out. But how do you start the business off? You say, right, I've got this business, an empty warehouse. I'm going to wait for them to decommission some buildings. And then, I know you're involved in construction industry, obviously, but then somebody's got to want that material, and then there's all sorts of constraints about why that would happen. So how do we go from where we are now, when it's conceivable you could reuse it, to actually making it happen, getting through all those difficult barriers to get there. It could take years, it might never happen, but it's conceivable, and therefore why don't we investigate it and come up with some solutions? And I think it's fair that Julian All's in demand project, and there's other projects going as well, Cranfield got something going as well. But then even if they come up with, it makes sense to do it. One comment I heard from a presentation I organised a conference earlier this year was the dismantlers say it took too long to dismantle. We just want to knock the thing down, chuck it in a skip, because it'll take us a week to do it. To dismantle it takes 2 days to knock it in a skip. Well, that's, you know, clearly that seems like a big hurdle for them. But the life cycle benefit is massive, you know, because you don't have to remelt the stuff. So, but again, it's all about getting through these social hurdles, you know, and it would be about improving the demountability. But also, as you're probably very well aware, builders are not going to build things out of materials unless they've got some cast iron guarantee that there's not going to be a problem with it, you know. So yeah, so the reality is no, we haven't. Although there is an example of us leasing some roofing materials. There is an example of that, yes. The other thing is that let's say you are leasing these materials, what control have you got in 20 years' time when they come back to you? So there's lots of hurdles. But I like the concept. Okay.
Buildings as material banks, as some people refer to it. Yeah.
Surface mining.
Yeah.
Yeah, Paul Eakins. This is really directed to our two political scientists here, because I mean, what Nick said was that the strength of the Commission, and I think there's huge evidence of this, is in targets and standard setting. I mean, that is what makes things happen. But in the current political context, that is precisely what member states are trying to resist.
They always do, though, to be fair.
Well, but the balance of power seems to have shifted in that domain recently. And so I'd just like some comments from the panel about the targets and standards. I mean, just a little anecdote from the EREC thing. The EREC recommendation that Potocznik was determined to get was the resource productivity target. He was convinced that without any kind of high-level objective moving in that direction, nothing would happen. And he may well be right. Whether or not that target is now endorsed and then becomes part of Commission policy and therefore in a directive and is rolled out. So I'd just like you to talk a little bit as a panel about targets and standards and you know, in the current context, how they might be pursued effectively, including the chair.
I'll keep it briefer than my first intro. I think targets are very important, and the Commission is the right institution to come up with a proposal. And obviously, sometimes it aims somewhere between Parliament, which used to be the greenest, and the Environmental Council, and that worked quite well in the past. But I think the kind of advocacy coalitions between a sort of an environmental advocacy coalition and the economic feasibility coalition have become much more complex than in the past, where it was straightforward. There would be DG Environment, the Environment Committee, and the Environment Council take one position, and then DG whatever Industry and the Committee from the European Parliament. And now I think this has all become a bit more complex, and it is a politically much more sensitive time. But as I said, in the 1990s, there was a discussion like this: should the Commission really, whatever the nooks and crannies, as Douglas Hurd put it, get involved in that? Should it set targets for bathing water, for drinking water, and all that? And then there was the EU Water Framework Directive, and what followed is, well, you can't just implement, you need also directives. So you need to really go down and have the targets there as well. So I think the targets will not disappear. It's just some targets will become much harder to actually agree, both within the newly elected European Parliament and also within the Council. The environmental leader states, as they're called, or pioneers, they are obviously now, there are more, there are 28 member states, and there are some member states, especially with resource efficiencies, that worry an awful lot, and some probably have to worry an awful lot, as compared to other more prosperous and more industrialized member states. They will probably do worse, and they are worried about the big impact see is on climate change and coal, and anything that's got to do with coal. Be very interesting to see what Donald Tusk does when he takes over, I think on Monday, as the elected president for the European Council, when he has to deal with the Polish Prime Minister, who will not be very keen on two ambitious targets. But I think the Commission is still in the business of setting targets which are then need to be acceptable to the European Parliament and the Council. And the concern is obviously that the Commission becomes too tame and doesn't dare. And I think business is often happy about a slightly more ambitious target, but a long-term target, than no clarity at all in the long to medium term. So I think it's also from a business perspective, and obviously the businesses and the NGOs that favour that, they need to also support the Commission in that regard, because the Commission, if it gets bashed from everyone, if it doesn't have the political support, it will find it increasingly difficult to actually put its neck out and not get beaten from anyone.
I agree with Rudy. I think the Commission really needs to be able to make an economic harmonisation case, and that's what the Barroso Commission was trying to do quite effectively with its 2020 vision for sustainable, inclusive, whatever else it was, Euro to get around. I think as well, I'm glad you asked the question, because one of the other comments I had was about targets and objectives, and the fact that there needs to be coherence and a clear agenda driving the targets and objectives. And Michelle, you talked about resource efficiency having implications for the emissions trading scheme, which I thought was really interesting, because actually if you become more resource efficient, you potentially might drive down the price of carbon, which is great from a business perspective, but from a low carbon economy perspective isn't necessarily great, because then if the price goes down, people will use it more. And there's been a battle between DG Energy and DG Environment, DG Climate and DG Energy, over precisely that in the last Commission, where you saw DG Energy winning the debate. So you've now got an energy efficiency policy which kind of undermines the ETS a little bit. So there needs to be clear targets, but there also needs to be coherence about what is the agenda that we're trying to achieve. And I guess Juncker's agenda is a growth agenda. And I think you can make an economic case on those grounds for resource efficiency. I think that potentially is bad for every other aspect of environmental policy.
Yeah, and there is one thing as well that, if I may, is interesting in the terms, because whether you talk about resource efficiency or circular economy, sometimes it could be kind of a conflict. And I'll take a very concrete example, directly taken from your presentation, Louis. Caterpillar, for instance, when they started in the 70s with their remanufacturing program, obviously that goes hand in hand with a take-back system, and you have a deposit on the engine and so on. Everything geared up towards them recapturing those materials. So if they went down the resource efficiency route alone, they would have used less steel in their engine blocks. What they did in the end, it was designed to fit that very system. And in fact, they added more metal to their engines because they had the removable piston sleeves, not to be very geeky about diesel engine here, or any internal combustion engine, but the fact is the wear and tear happens when the piston goes up and down. And if you don't have an internal casing that you can remove that and acts as a fuse, then you can only rebore that hole for about 2 or 3 times. But if you add that metal, and we might be talking 2 or 3 kilos of steel per engine block, then this allows you to get maybe 20, 25 life cycles out of one engine block. So in effect, where does efficiency hamper effectiveness? And if we go down too much a reductionist agenda, and I'm talking about setting the priority here, if we only focus on that reduction target, the target that the Dutch negotiation was the GDP divided by raw material consumption, which has a raft of other implications, because how are recycled materials, we've had that conversation with Teresa many times, how are recycled materials accounted in that equation? So yeah. It is very important. Yeah.
Can I just pick up Charles' point about the difficulties between the environment and energy directions? Because I think that sort of underpins what I said. I mean, what I said was focus on targets and standards, And I could have said, and therefore don't focus on market-based instruments and taxes. And that's, with Paul in the room, I have to say that's not because those are not potentially useful. It's that if the political agenda is getting more difficult, I don't see any hope of getting a carbon price at a useful level out of the coming period. In which case we may as well accept that if we're going to make gains on carbon, it's going to be by energy efficiency policy and renewables policy, as it has been for the last 5 years. The EU ETS has done virtually nothing. So that's what I mean about being getting the tactics right and focusing on the stuff that might make a difference that is politically achievable. But I'm not political scientist.
Well, one thought from me on targets. I'm all for targets if they achieve the desired effect and they're well thought through, but I'm not sure they are. You can look at some targets that don't seem to go anywhere near the direction they want to go in. But the politicians, once they've set them, will justify that it has achieved it somehow, or either that, or the people who are subjected to achieving targets fiddle around with their own figures to end up with a desirable effect. So I don't mind them, but they've got to be well thought out, and maybe the scenarios of how the targets might be achieved should be well thought through before they say, right, that'll work. It's going to be a win-win, that one. So, and there are some examples of that.
Can I just add something to Paul Jardy's point? As in when I also started, he also didn't have an environmental agenda. He was talking about having 3 children, 1 child being sick, and comparing with the economy, emphasizing the need for the economy. It was only in the second Barroso Commission that he emphasized that climate change and growth agenda were actually something. So I think one has to be a bit careful when the Commission President comes in. It's a different political context, but I would not have called Barroso a very sort of environmentally minded president in his first few years.
True, although he had Hedegaard there in his second one as well, we don't have that kind of personality in the Commission at the moment, because the US has got well, see what was in these months.
Thanks. I'll take another question. Yes.
Steve Elkin, I Deputy Director for Evidence at DEFRA, one of the people looking at these targets. One thing that's really obvious is you've got the big idea, which is a more circular economy, but then you've got lots of very small and prescriptive targets that interact in ways that are quite perverse in some cases. What are the ideas about how to improve the way the targets are expressed? Can we throw away the framework that has been proposed?
I would say,
Can I just ask Steve to give some examples?
Yes.
Just give an example or two of these interactions that aren't working.
One example would be that we would like to promote resource efficiency, but the main target is a 70% recycling rate, which is about gross weight that's recycled. So actually more food waste is good as long as we recycle it.
Well, that would be my whole point. You know, you've got to think about what is the overall life cycle impact of the target, and what will be the consequences, and you need to think through the scenarios to get there. But if you think through well enough, you might come with a better target that's not quite the same, or dual targets, I don't know.
Yeah. Unless you take a time frame to that approach and say, business as usual is X. What we need to address it is a target of 70% of recycling, but it doesn't mean to say that's the objective. It might be a transition scenario towards more circularity, and that's where the clarity, I think, is very important, is where you go with those measures. In the end, what's the end goal? What can you foresee? I agree with you. If you just say, okay, well, it's recycled 70%, then great, let's get more stuff coming, and that will be fine. Actually, if you say, this is only to address the situation we have it on the pathway towards a more regenerative system, then it makes sense. So there might be a lack of vision as well.
Except I think the problem there is if you don't have targets, or people think that it's an option, so it's a process rather than an end goal, then actors might not engage in it. I mean, I suppose it's one of those issues for all of us from different perspectives. How do you come up with sensible targets where people don't just focus on the target and forget about all the impacts of focusing on the target? And I guess I would throw it back at you. I mean, it seems to me that if we want to have sensible which I study and love and think is amazing that it actually works at all. But it's not very good at coming up with targets that then work at the national and the local level that take into account all the different stakeholders that you have in 28 different states. And I suppose that's the challenge for the Commission and for Member States and for businesses to try and feed into those. And when I used to work in Brussels, all too often we'd be approached by people saying, you've come up with these ridiculous rules, and we'd be saying, well, we're on the last day of voting in the European Parliament. Did you not notice this 2 years ago when it was being negotiated? So I think it's incumbent on states and on businesses and on the other stakeholders to be aware of what's happening in Brussels, and maybe Brussels to communicate that more effectively to the people whose lives they're going to be affecting.
I made the vague statement on my slide saying that the regulators need to be much more aware of life cycle thinking. So an example of what you said about, let's say we reduce food waste by 70%, there's two almost opposite approaches. You could say, well, we could try and get the waste we've got and turn it to bioethanol or something, or compost. Or you could reduce portions, or change the portion size of food. You know, and that's where somebody's got to think it through and think, well, which of those two is going to get the desired effect, and which one will work in terms of social context as well. Because, you know, things that fail socially, there's an example of, well, I won't name the company, but it's probably obvious. So, washing fluids for clothes. Those companies are very committed to sustainability, try to concentrate them up so they had less packaging, less transport energy, if you like, and so on. But the consumer misused them, didn't understand them. And ridiculously, those companies who invested in their process to concentrate these things are now concentrating and diluting them to sell them. You know, so, and the point is, nobody thought through the social impacts about how people respond to it. Of course, now they're trying their best to come up with ways which will make it very convenient for them to use exactly the right amount. That might work. I hope it does. But and this is where triple bottom line comes in. The social, economic, environmental thing. You try to solve things here, but if it doesn't get accepted, it won't work. You know? So I think that through.
Just one last comment. I think having a holistic approach is always the more desirable one, but it's always extremely difficult to take everything into consideration. So there's a tendency to focus on the small little things and have fixed targets there. I think what's very difficult at the European level, more than on the member state level, is sort of to have a review after a certain period of time when you see this hasn't actually worked in the way we wanted it. I mean, the bathing water, to come back to that, it's a classic example. Adopted in the 70s, it was twice an attempt to review. We never reviewed because no one could agree. And everyone was in agreement it needs reviewing. And you have the same thing with other small things. I think on resource efficiency it's even more important. You're unlikely to get this right with the first sort of throw of the dice. This will need to be adjusted. And that's not very easy to do on the European level. And I think that is, but it's because it takes so long, so many actors involved, but that's definitely a problem there that I fully agree with.
And it reflects the fact that we're talking to a certain extent about systemic change rather than just a tweak to the existing model. Sorry, please. Yeah.
Graham Stevens, bluegreenuk.com. It's the question about enforcement and timescale of enforcement. The Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive was enacted in 1991. Now Thames Water are making a proposal to comply by 2023. They've been condemned and found guilty by the court. The last time Commissioner Potocnik came, he said that he would prefer to do anything else but go to court with Member States. So he proposed to have seminars with governments, which I tried to arrange with the Environment Minister, but he declined. And the Environment DEFRA are refusing to listen to the evidence on the new water industry. So this sort of organisational bureaucratic problem of government perceptions on the urgency of climate change. Scientists now saying we've got about 10 years before things get really irreversible. Is there any advance on the Commissioner's proposal to have these governmental seminars to try and change the perception of government on the urgency? Because the rights to say, as I said to Commissioner Potocnik, that going through the courts is very, very, very slow. And the air pollution judgment last week proposed that since the UK can't comply with the air quality directive, that they should make a 5-year plan in order that they want to delay for another until 2030, I think it is. So these timescales are completely mismatched with the urgency of climate change.
That's a very good question. Anybody had any thoughts on that before I give the floor to Paul for closing comments?
Well, I was teaching my students who are environmental scientists about the Air Quality Directive just last week, and one of them said to me, what's the point of fining states if they say they can't afford to implement directives? And I thought that was quite a good point, although I would question with some states whether or not the reason they're not implementing them is because of cost. And it's an unanswerable question, really. Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's a massive gap between what scientists saying on the one hand needs to happen within a short timescale and the way that politicians are reacting to that. I mean, in one sense, I think Potocnik's idea about having seminars with environment ministers and heads of government to sort of talk through these issues is the right one, and certainly enforcement mechanisms that have worked well on the international stage proceed through negotiation and carrots rather than sticks. So I'm thinking the Montreal Protocol in particular. But that is slow, and I don't know what the answer is. I genuinely don't know what the answer is, and it's obviously very worrying for those of us who care about the environment and who think that governments need to be taking action. There seems to be a dearth of leadership, and we can say, well, maybe that's because of the financial crisis, but at some point somebody has to take leadership. And the EU has this reputation of being an environmental leader, but I'm worried in the run-up to Paris next year to what extent that the EU will be playing that role. We don't even know who's going to be negotiating. Will it be Cañete who will be speaking for Europe on climate change? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see that as a particularly Europe versus member state issue. I think it's a general issue that politicians find it difficult to cope with the seriousness of environmental threats, particularly when those haven't actually appeared yet in Europe. And that's climate change is the obvious one. I mean, I think the Commission has a particular problem, which is what I would call a legitimacy problem. You know, I mean, I'm not a member of UKIP. I'm very far from being a member of UKIP, but I mean, we do need to recognise that as an issue that commissioners face every day in dealings with member states.
It's also quite ironic that we complain about the dictatorship of short-termism quite a lot, but when it comes to those issues, actually.
We could do with some short-termism.
Sorry.
On the legal one, I think the average when I looked at it last time is something like 3 to 5 years over the first court judgment. But when it goes to the court the second time around, as far as I could see, I looked at it very recently, the member states that have been issued with fines, they have actually corrected the environmental law fairly quickly. So it does seem to have some impact. That doesn't mean that everything should go to the court automatically. And if anything, the Commission starting already with the premise sort of having been moved out from the legal DG for DG Environment under when Diana disappeared, there was less emphasis on taking member states to the court, more dialogue, and I think the UK also initiated this in-home network, and I think there's a lot of sense to actually talk to member states and say, what's your problem? But some member states, they understand what their problem is, but they still don't do anything about it. And I think there comes a point when this isn't good enough any longer, and it takes a very long time, and I think for some cases you quite clearly need the European Court of Justice. You could have otherwise voluntary collections and agreements, and they don't work amongst companies and they don't work very well amongst countries either, especially not in an internal market where companies and countries to some degree compete with each other.
Thank you very much. I think we need to stop
Yeah.
now.
Well, we probably do need to wrap up, and I'm not going to talk for a quarter of an hour. I'd like to thank you all for coming. I'm just going to give you my high-level takeaways from today. We started with Andrew, and then I was really pleased to hear a little more or less pessimistic stuff coming out of Rudy here. I mean, I think there is still a lot to play for in the environmental agenda in the new Commission. And I accept what Andrew was saying, that quite a lot of the early signs are not particularly propitious. But I think Rudy's point is also very good, and I remember myself, I don't think I've ever been enthused by a president of the Commission when they first took office, and yet sometimes one is pleasantly surprised. So I think there is a lot to play for. And I think this discussion we've had about what is important is terribly telling. I mean, I do find it depressing that something like the Soil Directive, which soil seems to me to be pretty important. I'm not an expert on what the Soil Directive was trying to do, and it may be that it was being killed off because it was not fit for purpose. But I think the state of Europe's soils is clearly an important issue, and it would be good to have recognition of that in an EU-wide directive, because we tend to have directives about the things that we think are important. Now, it's fascinating, someone said, does the EU need to set targets? And then they mentioned bathing waters. As a boy, I used to take my holidays in Cornwall with the family. And it was very common that I'd be swimming in the sea next to bits of feces all round me. This was absolutely common. Presumably as a boy I was swallowing this stuff, and then that could ruin the holiday because one didn't feel very good. That doesn't happen now to anything like the same extent, and actually I don't remember it happening. I probably swim in the sea a little less regularly than I did, but nevertheless I'm still a keen marine swimmer. So I think those kinds of targets are critical. And yet, who has ever given the EU credit for that kind of change to our qualities of life? I mean, who has ever gone out and said, yeah, you guys, you did that? Because we wouldn't have done that. Our national government would not have done that, left to its own devices, without wastewater treatment. So I think those kinds of things are really important. I think it's depressing that there needed to be a lot of pressure to acknowledge sustainable development as an EU objective, and that comes back to these issues of consistency. It really doesn't help when government policy at the highest level seems to sort of zigzag and change direction. 1 minute sustainable development is absolutely the most important thing on earth, as with the Gothenburg Directive and whenever it was, and then suddenly it drops off the agenda altogether. And it's not just a semantic thing being replaced by something else, because it wasn't really replaced by anything else. And that then leads to the resource efficiency stuff, which, as I say, I think it would be a huge mistake for that to disappear after only 5 years of being hyped up. And I think it was somebody said, it may have been Teresa said, that this business of, is it the economy working with the environment in order to produce both a better economy and higher quality of life, or is there this interminable trade-off between the two? And the resource efficiency narrative was explicitly trying to argue for the latter position. And I think it will be very, very sad if that is lost, and if we move back into a situation where the economy is perceived to be the enemy of the environment, because whenever we've been in that situation, we know which wins. And that is an unfortunate fact. The economic imperative is paramount. That leads me really to a question that Charlie raised, which was, I think it was you, about the rebound effect and all that, and to the extent that resource efficiency is important, and to the extent that resource efficiency happens, there is a danger of a rebound effect. I'll bet Nick knows what's coming now, because we've talked about this many times, but one of the most important recommendations of EREP, and something that Potocznik himself was very keen on, was the rebalancing of the fiscal system so that prices of resources went up at the same time as they became more efficient. That, of course, means that other taxes can go down, so you get your competitiveness benefits from reducing costs on labour while not increasing bills. Bills, of course, are price times quantity. If the price goes up and you get more efficient, then the quantity goes down, the bill stays the same, you don't get a rebound effect because you haven't got all this money sloshing around in your pockets that you're going to go and take off, but you have a lower taxation system on the factors of production, and every economist knows that that is economically beneficial. Very difficult agenda. Nick said how difficult it was. It's supremely ironic that the one thing that really would be good at the European level was this rising floor price on carbon and energy through the energy tax directive has been stuck in the Commission. And I must say, I don't think my own government plays a particularly heroic role in its opposition to any kind of taxation initiatives from Brussels. I think the semester process is very important, and that's a kind of innovation which I haven't really got to the bottom of yet, the way the European Commission recommends policies to member states. I mean, clearly it doesn't go down the bundle in the UK because we don't like the European Commission recommending things to us on the basis of the publicity that the last semester process related to the UK. I think that's just silly, given that the people who work in the Commission are pretty smart and they are sitting outside the system, and they may well have sensible things to say to the UK that we should take some notice of. And finally, I'd like to address this issue of legitimacy, because I mean, I think we all are all aware that the EU is in a bad place at the moment, especially in the UK. And there probably are legitimacy issues that need to be faced. And there probably is need for reform. And I hope that with the UCL, European Institute, we will actually start over the course of the next year or two to put some flesh on the bones of reform, because we never hear, apart from abolishing freedom of movement within the EU, we never hear what these reforms might be. A reform I would like to see is that more people, and I'm sure I'm not referring to anyone in this audience, more people actually understand how the European Union works. Most people out there think the European Commission sets the rules, sets the legislative proposals, which it does, and then passes them, and then imposes them willy-nilly on member states who have had absolutely no say in anything to do with that process, which of course everybody here knows is completely not the case. But most people out there don't know that that's not the case, and they imagine this body called Brussels imposes legislation. And I think there's a huge task among those of us who feel that the EU has an important role to play in this area, actually to spread just a little bit more of real information about how the EU works, without by any means denying that there is scope for reform, there is scope for greater legitimacy. We've now got what is euphemistically called a networking reception. What it basically means you have a chance to have a few drinks and chat among yourselves about what we've been talking about today. Teresa will tell us in a minute where this is taking place, and I imagine it's reasonably close. Thank you very much for coming. We will be writing this up, and if you would like to be kept in touch with the final paper that will go to the Commission that we'll be talking about in Brussels, please do give your email address to Teresa on the show. Thank you very much indeed for coming, and thanks to all our panel.